Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and I'm really looking forward to the guest this evening. I met him out in Dallas this summer at the MUFON event, and I thought he was a great speaker, and he really digs right into all the Texas UFO cases. So I'm really glad to have him. I'm glad to be here actually on election night, so you can, and U.S. people that is, you can escape for a little while your election anxiety. So here we are. And as people that know me here, I don't talk about politics on this show. And I'm glad not to. I need to escape from it too. So anyway, we are here on this night. I'm not sure what the amount of traffic people are going to be watching it live. Hopefully it's the same as usual, maybe more. We'll see. But the blog this week actually pertains to one of the topics we're going to be talking about. Charles Lear wrote a blog this week, and it is called APRO, that's APRO, MUFON, and the Cash Landrum case, which those of you who have been watching my show for a long time, you know that I was one of the very few people to get Colby Landrum on this show here, and that was some time ago, and it was a pretty good interview. As far as I know, I've reached out to him a number of times, and he's not doing any podcasts or anything as far as I know. Let's see, merchandise. So we have some people ordering the T-shirts. I hope you and take a look. It's over at podcastufo.com where our blogs are and other information, and you'll see the merchandise there. And it's reasonably cost podcast UFO merchandise. So check that out when you can. And I want to thank everyone that helps out with the show. There's so many people. I'll just name a couple. Donna helps as the producer and does a lot of work behind the scenes. I have all these people that have been helping a long time: Palmer, Brock, Peggy, Phil, who's been helping me for a long time. There's so many people again, and I'm hoping I'm not missing anyone right now. Of course, Charles Lear helps out with these great blogs with information every single week. And anyway, I think, and I want to thank all those too right now, all you listening and all the people that support the show. Thank you so much. And here we are ready to bring in our guest. Hello, Daniel.
Greetings. Hey, Martin. Great to be able to finally be here with you. I know we talked about this for a few months now, and it's awesome to be on the show with you. Thanks.
That's right. Yeah, I know it was quite difficult because you're a drummer and a teacher, and you have you're very busy schedule. So but I'm honored to have you on. And I really love the interaction you had when you were doing your talks. I thought you know the topic extremely well, and really reacted well with the audience as well. So anyway, glad you're here. I'm surprised I was just saying this ahead of the show. I'm surprised I don't see you on a lot of TV programs because you're just so well versed in this.
Well, thanks. I had a great time at the event. It was a great opportunity to have it here in my hometown area, the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex, and an awesome opportunity to kind of shed light on some of the lesser known and historical cases here in the Lone Star State. When it comes to multimedia, when it comes to all these different shows that are on network television and all that, it's interesting. I don't keep up with a whole lot these days, but it's not something that pops up there a whole lot anymore. I would get a few pitches every once in a while, and it would be for some new and interesting concept. But what it seems like, I think that most network television is interested in is the assured formula that seems to be rehashing a lot of the old shows. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it's something that becomes redundant after a while. I find that in addition to my day job, which is, as you mentioned, a private music teacher and a drummer, I am already busy enough with that. But I think that, for the leisure time that I have, I really try to stay dedicated to research projects. And while I don't mind making appearances at events like we were at a few months ago, and I think it's important to help generate awareness in the community, not necessarily to abdicate a particular stance on believing certain things or anything really, but more than just bringing to attention some of the interesting parts of our history or modern things that are going on in a way that can help us just understand from all angles. And so when it comes to the shows, I think they're curious, as far as what they can do to stir the minds of interesting concepts. But at the same time, a lot of it becomes very much edited in post-production, as you know, and ends up being taken out of context sometimes. So I'm not opposed to it, but it hasn't been something that's been at the top of my priorities lately. But it's a great way for people to become aware of topics that they otherwise might not be familiar with, or unless they go out of their way or someone else tells them about. It's great to see, and I have a lot of friends that regularly appear on various programs as well. So that's cool to see them too.
Right. So I'm going to talk quickly about the elephant in the room, so to speak. It's just because I've been getting a lot of email about two subjects. One is on Netflix recently dropped the Manhattan alien abduction with Linda Napoleano. I believe that's how you say her name, something like that. So a lot of people wanted me to weigh in on that, so to speak. But I did watch all the episodes on that. I don't know how popular my opinion's going to be. People are asking me about that, but I get really, and a lot of people do not like my opinion of Bob Lazar either. But when I see something that is absolutely, there's deception seen, then it makes me wonder about the whole case. That's the way my nature is. And for instance, when you see the supposed witnesses, handwriting, and I do a lot of handwriting analysis for authenticating documents and things like that. And I'm telling you, the handwriting between Linda and the witnesses, or at least two of them that they showed, line up perfectly, like it would be her handwriting, I got to tell you. So that makes me really wonder about that case. That being said, we'll put that, I will tell you, it's a great production. It's very well done. Check it out on Netflix when you can. And it's the Manhattan alien abductions, the name of that. The second one that people are contacting me, I'm sorry for taking the time on this, Daniel, but I thought it would be better to address this. The second one a lot of people are contacting me on is the image that Lou Elizondo showed during a Philadelphia presentation. And it's really just a reflection on, I'm really surprised that he didn't vet this more carefully. It's a reflection of a light, basically, like a chandelier or a floor lamp or something on a window. And I've actually done a video on that, reflections, how they can, there's a famous one you see all the time in 1950, I think it is, in Massachusetts, at like a Navy station or something like that, where you see these lights in a triangle formation. That's lights inside the building itself reflecting on the window. And that it's easily mistaken, but I just thought, I was surprised that he mistakenly used that. And we'll just call it a mistake because I don't think there was any ill intentions at all. We'll just call it a mistake, but I thought I'd address it. I don't know if you want to chime in on any of that, but
I'll just say that I think it's important to pay attention to the media being released, and it's something that, whether you, like you mentioned, whether you have a particular view on it or not, I think it's just good to be aware of what material is out, what's being promoted. And of course, with this recent issue with Elizondo, I'll actually be seeing him here in a few weeks. He's coming to Dallas on the 20th. And I'll wonder if that's actually still in his presentation. I guess we'll find out. But I did see about that. People are very opinionated online. And all I know, and there's a whole show that could be done about this situation, but I just do remember seeing that he made a response, basically giving a hats off to the internet of people who managed to figure this out. And I'm just thinking, wasn't he claiming to be the director of a program that investigated UFOs for the government? And so it's very curious to think like this is something that has actually happened. But here we are, and
yeah,
it's still an ongoing book tour as far as I'm concerned. He is going to be here and giving a similar presentation. So I'll just have to gauge what he does then. And, hopefully it gives me a different perspective in person.
Right. And I'm surprised, in his tweet, I'm sure you saw that, where he basically is apologizing, and he's talking about how quickly that people found, what it was. John Greenwald, I think, is possibly the one that actually may have uncovered that as a Facebook post. But he claims that, someone from the government had given him this. And if that is true, then that also makes you wonder, this seems like someone trying to, discredit him, possibly. I don't know. I have an open mind about the whole thing. But, if he indeed trusted someone because of that image, then he's going to really question who it is he's trusting.
Oh, definitely.
No. Yeah, but interesting. So let's. I want to ask you, what do you think? I mean, there's so many great cases. I was looking at all these cases in Texas, so many great ones. What is your go-to favorite? I'll ask you right off the bat.
Oh, wow. Well, I think for most people who've ever followed along, that's kept up with anything that I've been involved with, it's easy to just say Aurora, but there's a lot of reasons why I think it's something that more than just a UFO case is a fun part of history to look into. But aside from that, for ones that I think really matter as far as what we can tangibly do, and not that there's nothing that can be done about Aurora, but I would say that one like the Stephenville case, a much more modern and very highly credible case, one that would sometimes be called a flap, in some circumstances where you have a number of people witness an object tracked on radar. The military had a response to having F-16s pursuing or in proximity to the object, law enforcement, MUFON, investigators, all this stuff, So I think that this is a helpful way that we can see that it's a well-documented case, number of people in the town, Stephenville, Texas, in the beginning of 2008. And people still describe seeing things, and I think that there are military maneuvers. I see things, where I live. I'm not too far away from Stephenville, and the Naval Reserve that those F-16 came from is not too far from where I live and work. But I would say that it's important to keep in mind that this is a very possibly rare instance where people describe seeing UFOs all the time, and in Texas, and it's hard to keep track of a lot of that. I have a network, a group that basically is just a networking hub. It's not necessarily an investigative group, but it's called the Texas UFO Network, where people can share about things. And there's so much that happens. And I think just with things like Starlink satellites and Falcon launches and things like this, we have an influx of UFO reports in general, just because people will, and I think for a while, not be able to understand exactly what they're seeing. And because of those instances, I think there's just a lot more noise. But it doesn't mean that they're not important to look into or to be able to forward to the appropriate parties. But I would say that with something like Stephenville, the Stephenville UFO incident, there's been a number of media productions made, either documentary based or online podcasts and things that people have talked about. And this is what's really cool as well. If you want to show that picture, you're welcome to. This is myself and a colleague of mine, Chase Howard. We went to the first ever, and maybe only ever, what they call the ET Festival last year. The Chamber of Commerce or Merchants in the downtown area, this is held on the historic square. They decided to put together an event that sort of commemorates a bit of their weirder history that for a while no one really wanted much attention for in the town. I think Dublin, Dr. Pepper actually did some promotional things and merchandise around that time, which is sort of a rare, coveted set of items these days. But I would say that what's cool to see is that the people in some form of officialdom have actually welcomed the idea of embracing this as a community. Maybe not all together in a particular view, but just to say, hey, let's get together about something interesting. And so they invited me to come out and to give a presentation on Texas UFOs, but also they had other family-friendly activities. So I think it's great when there are festival-related events, because it's something that garners the attention of a bit more of a family environment rather than the serious-toned researchers and conferences, which is awesome. That's all great too, but they're not really as narrowed into the UFO research as maybe they are in the ability to kind of put together local community events. So I'm all for that. I think it's great to see, and it's helpful to bring people again into a better form of awareness when it comes to these subjects and the history of some of these local areas to a lot of these people who live in these locations around the state, or who are moving in and from wherever, and they don't know that this has some interesting history. And I just kind of going back into your original question of what do I think, other than Aurora, which we can dive into, I think that Stephenville as a modern case really deals with some of the more important aspects of a UFO investigation altogether. Again, with the hard evidence, people always ask, where's the hard data? There might be some photographs that people took, but you have citizens, law enforcement, official people in town, all describing perceiving an aircraft of some sort or some kind of object, whether it was flying or people perceive it to be using some propulsion whatever forms of interpretation there are of this object. It's not just people. This was tracked on radar. You have the F-16s. It was said that up to 10 or more F-16s were out in pursuit or in some form of rendezvous in accordance with this object flying from horizon to horizon, sometimes called the flying Walmart. It was an enormous object, mile-wide craft or something perhaps. And so it makes us wonder, people always wonder, are these ours or theirs or whoever, and so it's very curious that with all the things that have come out since 2008, remember, this is after, a lot of the buzz in the last several years have been about the Tic Tac. This is even after the Tic Tac event from 2004. And it's just, at the time, that was never made aware by, the news or anything. And so when 2008 came around and this became an incident, Ken Cherry, who at the time was with MUFON, came forward with a press release, and he went on Larry King, and he actually was asked to resign from MUFON because it caused quite a stir. The information of the case was being released without, chain of command. There's a lot of controversy about that, but I would just say that the important thing is that you had a lot of eyes on this, a lot of people from within the town, a lot of people coming outside, and it was a pretty extensively investigated situation that Ken did eventually have a book come out, and I did bring some literature just for anyone who's literature buff. I'm a huge fan of books and things, so he came out with this one as a fictionalized version so that he could include things that he wouldn't normally be able to say otherwise. So I thought that was pretty clever of Ken. I worked with him for a number of years, and so he's probably the go-to person when it comes to the Stephenville UFO case. And I would just say, from the full spectrum of historical events, being this is probably one of the most modern ones, not just in Texas, but overall in the world, probably, and as far as recent cases are concerned, that has a lot of this substance to it. And I think the radar tracking is really important. So, in 2008, that was the big headlines, and that's what actually got me interested in looking around here in my local area to find if there were any groups or anyone that really knew about that situation. And then the next year, I started to connect with different people. Then a little bit after that, I found EPIC, which was the group that Ken Cherry formed after being involved with MUFON, and it was the Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council with Jim Mars, and that's how I met him as well. So I got involved with that group with Ken and Jim and a lot of other great people who are still friends, and it looked at things more than just UFOs, which I thought was very interesting because I am fascinated, as you and many of the watchers and listeners are. The unexplained is just so fascinating that there's a lot of different aspects to what you can go down, and go down the rabbit hole of any of these different things. And I've taken the time to look into a lot. I really find ufology historically and the current things going on interesting, from just the phenomenon, all the different types of UFO phenomena that there are, as well as the cultural aspects of studying that as well.
Right. So while we're on Stephenville, the Bush Ranch was involved in this, right? I mean, am I getting them mixed up, or is this one where the Bush Ranch there was a flyover close to?
Right. That's actually it, and it makes people consider that with the President Bush at the time, you have this area that's not too far away, and if there's something flying over, I think the most relatable thing we've seen recently are these ideas of the China spy balloons and things. Well, this is happening, and they're not alien spaceships or whatever other ideas of anomalous phenomena are. If they're just adversarial nations or any rogue nations or any nation that hasn't announced or declared that they're in airspace, that is in the most technical sense of the term, that's a threat to national security. And whether it's actually a threat or not, physically or however else, that's essentially what it becomes looked at on the radar whenever you have something that's an enormous, possibly a craft flying over potentially near where the president lives. That should sound quite a few alarms. And I think that with the recent ideas of the spy balloons not being nearly as the media sensation kind of took off a little bit, but then no one's heard anything. No one's had any follow up with the objects that were over Alaska or Canada. Right. Maybe there has been, but news stories have their 15 minutes of fame and they go on to the next biggest thing. And there's a lot that could be said about that, but I'll just mention that, yes, you are correct that the Bush Crawford Ranch, that whole farm area in Texas, is an enormous stretch of land. So to be able to go from, as they described, horizon to horizon effortlessly, and sort of blot out the sky. That's pretty startling, considering, if we do have, and obviously people do suspect, if you keep up with any of this, these ideas, is that people suspect that we do, in secret or in parallel to like the publicly or even military technologies, that we have pretty advanced things that could, do some incredible things. And it makes us wonder, not too far away, especially right near where the Naval Joint Air Base sent out those F-16s, we have Lockheed Martin and Skunk Works right here in the Fort Worth area. And, I'm not going to make any grandiose claims, but it's no secret that this private corporation, Lockheed, is basically buying or selling to the highest bidder in contracts with probably defense contractors. And it makes us wonder, are there really interesting things going on that they're making or working on or have been that haven't seen the light of day in years or decades? So, some of these things we know have happened. The SR-71, the stealth bomber, stealth fighter, all these ideas are something that were once secretive and now are seen at like air shows and things like that. And so we haven't had a lot of those things come out lately in a way that, unless you really like an aviation buff and you keep up with that and go to the air shows. I mean, I saw the Blue Angels coming back into town, so that's just one of the staples we see. But we're not seeing any black triangles making the debut at local air shows yet, anyway. So it would be cool if maybe some of these things are actually going to be released. Like, yeah, we've had this for a while, although that's a huge can of worms. But I would say that if something's flying over that's not ours, in the sense of the U.S. And someone else, then that should be utmost attention on any security that can actually track that. And so a lot of people did. I think that you have I think Peter Davenport did some reporting and found that the track that was on radar, and so that's considered hard evidence in a lot of ways. And I think that it's just one of those things where if this was going on, you had someone else who's looking out to fly over the president, it's a pretty big deal. And if it's not, if it's someone here that is working on these things in secret, that's incredible. It would be weird to think that there aren't actually, I think, this might not be a popular opinion, but I would say it would actually be weird to think that there aren't super secret programs out there that can do incredible things that are often misidentified as UFOs. It would be like a huge waste of money and opportunity if that hasn't been happening for years. It's odd to think it's not. But anyway, so I think that's another interesting element to that case, is that it was near Crawford Ranch where Bush and family lived.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned this is, I don't want to go way off track or whatever, but this was me filming this. I was actually underneath the spy balloon when it was shot. I mean, it was just very ironic that it happened to be there. But the thing I wanted to say that, and we'll get right back to your topic, but I still think it was very weird that they had those two shoot downs right away, right after that. And then you don't hear about anything else. I mean, that's bizarre. And really not, like you said, not much talk about it, really. So strange.
I would say that, despite the intention of whatever actually did cause that to happen, events like that can be, and there's a lot that could be said about this with tons of different things and go down this whole rabbit hole. But I would say that sometimes events can be taken advantage of and exploited for the purpose of political, military, commercial, whatever gain. And be spun into something different. So maybe this is a product of that. I don't know, but it's interesting to see that was kind of back to back and then there's nothing. But I would just use those as a sort of analogy to relate that people forget about that. I mean, those were technically UFO sightings, and we I think we're able to in some way deduct that, okay, these seem to be like spy balloons and maybe this is where they originated and whatever's going on. So a lot of people like that we're seeing, just like what you showed, and they can't readily identify that. So people often forget that UFO, it often gets conflated with alien spaceship, but it's a subjective term. It's an individually subjective term that each person can relate to differently, because two or more people can see the same thing and not know what they're looking at. And one person might, but it's just one of those things that we often think a UFO must mean it's ET, and that's really what it is. But really, it's tough because I think when we continue to see things in modern times, it's easier to now relate it to drones, spy technology, satellites, whereas like back when these things weren't either commercially available or as big an issue, it's easier to say, okay, well, it must be otherworldly or something, So, and you see
Yeah.
a lot of that.
Right. Right. Here's every once in a while I'll pop maybe a question here.
Yeah.
This isn't actually a question, but Christopher is saying, having seen separately two 50 to 200-foot circular hard disk snow lights over Houston in 1991 and 2019. He's basically wondering if you heard of other sightings as such, like a disk with no lights.
Well, yeah, I think that one of the first things I would say to do, obviously, there are various reporting agencies. You're welcome to, we can continue the discussion on the Texas UFO Network, because that's a great way for people to find out, oh, I saw this too, or now that someone else is sharing, we can figure this out. And I think that even with the other databases available, it's helpful to know that there are resources when it comes to those dates. Nothing really stands out as far as what you describe as a large disc like that. There very well could be some reports, but the other thing is a lot of people don't report sightings. They just either keep it to themselves or maybe share with a few people. So I think that to come forward like that it takes a lot of courage, and it's tough to share about something that either isn't really very popular or people get ridiculed for. So yeah, I'd say that we can check the databases. MUFON has a database, and there are other old historical organizations that do have files. So I would say that it would be good to see, if we can find any relation between those dates and the locations of Houston. There's the Houston UFO Network as well. And people do try to figure out like what they can do in the community to help, if there are any other witnesses. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Now, when I was out in Texas and I asked the audience this summer, how many people think they saw a UFO? There was quite a few hands that went up. I'm telling you, it looked like I would have to guess at least 75 or 100 people put their hands up that they thought they saw a UFO. And when I asked the next question, which was, how many of you reported it? It was like 3 hands. So, and I think that's probably across the board. I know when I had my sighting in 2007, I did not report it. I didn't even know there was a place to report them. I mean, I think that's when you're out there in the public, you have no idea there's a MUFON or anything like that. And I called the police department, and there's, from what I understand, they generally will tell you can report it at either, Peter Davenport's or MUFON. I mean, but anyway, I would like to talk about, if it's okay with you, we can jump into the Aurora one, because that one is really fascinating. And I know there's some controversy about the grave site, and I know the town will not let there be the body exhumed or anything like that. Or do they even know exactly where it is?
There's a lot to that. And I want to take an opportunity, because Aurora is a pretty extensive, historically documented legend, I would say, in many ways. I try to look at it in a more broad sense than just a UFO case, although that is a really interesting part of how it's been interpreted throughout the years. But to really preface the Aurora story, I just want to shed light on a lesser known case that deals with a sighting well before even the Great Airship Mystery, to kind of give some context to the idea that UFOs, in the sense that, as far as what we call them, are not a new phenomenon. I think a lot of people in your viewership is probably familiar with this. But I want to just call to light the Denison saucer case, which there should be a visual of as well. And I just want to mention that, because what's important about understanding Aurora is that it's not an isolated event, whether it's historically proven or disproven. The idea that these airships, as they called them, were sort of the latest incarnation of UFOs, of just some aerial phenomenon. But predating even that by some 19 years is this idea of, in the Denison Daily News, it was reported that a farmer in North Texas, north of Dallas, named John Martin, described seeing an object that was moving, and it was a light. And he said that it first looked like it was the size of like an orange in the sky, and then it came closer and it looked like a saucer. And I think it's so interesting that he used that terminology of a saucer in 1878, north of Dallas, when, of course, you have years later Kenneth Arnold describing seeing crescent-shaped objects that moved like saucers, and that was kind of taken out of context in the media and now we have the term flying saucer, which has been, an umbrella term for a lot of this since the 50s. So I think that there's so much that happens that goes off the radar in most people's purview, just because we forget the language of terminology, the nomenclature changes, and so we forget how to research historical cases, because you start losing the term UFO before the 50s. It's just not relevant or present in society. So, and looking into these historical cases like Aurora, it starts being brought back into the modern scope of things with the renaming UFO and attachment to the story. So what's cool is, again, that we can kind of claim stake to the use of that term saucer here in Texas well before the whole flying saucer craze of the 50s and onward. And then like you mentioned, this is one of those things that it's helpful to see that as it comes to the end of the 1800s and the 19th century, you have what we call the Great Airship Mystery. And this is a series of events going from 1896 into 97, especially in the height of April 1897. There are newspapers throughout California, the Midwest, and in other states that are describing the airship, sometimes as a singular phenomenon or as various craft. And it's really important to also know that historically, even contemporary airships weren't even built in a way that was what was being described until the late into 1897 into November. David Schwartz made the first hard frame dirigible airship. And then, of course, 1898, 99, a lot more was actually being made. And then, of course, in 1903, you've got the Flyer by the Wright brothers. So it's not something that actually was all instantaneous as far as historically documented. Now, it's not to say that you didn't have people who were inventors. There actually is a lot of interesting speculation about various elite scientists, inventors, and groups of wealthy people who were putting together interesting schematics to form flying contraptions, whether they were more air balloon-like or blimp-like or dirigible or airship. There's ideas that basically incorporate some of these interesting artistic schematics by a guy named Charles Delchaux, who had these interesting drawings that were found in these books in a dumpster in Houston, Texas, interestingly enough. So this is all something that people wonder, are these just forms of art being like an artistic creation, or is it like real schematics by this group, the Sonora Aero Club, that were creating airships in the late 1800s that no one even knew about until like way later on? So I do think that there probably were inventors working on it, like the Wright brothers, but they were the ones who got sort of the claim to fame once their Flyer really took off and literally, and made the headline. So I think that sometimes we just remember what's documented. We have a tendency to forget as a society some of the things that get lost, that either aren't kept in the public domain or gets thrown out. So it's hard to say about some of the ephemera that could describe these things if they are authentic, and if it's really pointing to the idea that maybe the airships were inventors and not just, as the Aurora story suggests, not an inhabitant of this world. So I think that in the context of the Great Airship Mystery, a lot of people get the impression that the Aurora story was the first ever documented UFO, and not only that, the first ever documented crash. And I think that both of those things could be debated and say, well, technically no. You have a crash described in Nebraska in 1884. But also the ideas of UFOs in general. We just don't call them UFOs. They were airships, and then they were meteorological wonders, and all kinds of other things that people called them, dating well back before the 1800s too. But when it does come to Aurora, I think it's important how it stands out as probably now, these days, the most notable of the airship stories, because not only do you deal with someone who had seen something, and that picture you showed of the Dallas Morning News actually shows on the 5th page over a dozen other airship stories. Aurora was just there in the middle of the 5th page. And you have one from Merkel, Texas, that describes an anchor being let down and then cut off, and the town kept it there and in the public square for a while. And other people would hear singing from the airship, and the crew would come down and land and ask for supplies. Typically, these dealt with human-appearing occupants, the captain perhaps, but nothing too otherworldly for the most part. So when Aurora decided to either come up with the story or something did happen or whatever actually did happen, The way that it made the news was because of a writer there, a cotton trader named S.E. Hayden, which often gets misspelled in almost every book and article that came out about this. He wrote an article called "A Windmill Demolishes It," and essentially the idea is that an airship came down from the south, crashed into the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill on a farm, and because of the explosion, it scattered debris for acres, and the metal from the explosion, which seemed to be the contents of the ship, was silvery and aluminum, soft to the touch, and the farmers there, the Proctors, along with apparently other townsfolk, came to the wreckage to gather specimens of what it says was strange metal, and that the occupant, which was said to have been the only one on board of the airship, was found, at least the remains were badly disfigured, but enough of the original was recovered to determine, according to what was claimed to be the authority on astronomy, later found historically to be a blacksmith named T.J. Weems, said that it was of his opinion that he was an inhabitant of the planet Mars, and that based upon the remains that he was, quote, not an inhabitant of this world. And that's a very sensational claim. At the time, people, don't realize that science fiction and stories about otherworldly life was around, just not obviously in the same mediums. There were no movies or anything. But even things like War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, that came out the next year. The idea of Martians invading. So it's not impossible that people there, if this idea that, otherworldly beings was somehow in their literature and they were able to get a hold of it, they could learn that, okay, this is an idea being discussed and it's kind of culturally relevant. So the story itself didn't really get any attention for a long time, but it does also include that the otherworldly pilot was given a funeral the next day, or says tomorrow. Now, a lot of people, there's a lot of misconception. I learned about this case from our friend, the late and great Jim Mars, who lived nearby. He took me out to the cemetery. He would tell me about his time there, that in the 70s, there would be an uproar in this story resurfacing into the public and getting media attention in the local newspapers and investigative groups like MUFON, which at the time was headed by Bill Case, who was also the aviation writer for the Dallas Times Herald. You also have people like Hayden Hughes from the International UFO Bureau up in Oklahoma, who came down. And the idea essentially at the time was that these people thought enough of this case, of a UFO case as they interpreted it, to be able to look into potentially finding legal means to exhume the supposed grave in which the alleged alien has been buried. And that you can see there is a picture provided to me by Jim Mars of what has been called the original headstone. Now, whether that actually is a stone that was there the whole time, or was put in place, or was marking a real alien grave, or it's just someone's mischief, that was there at least in the early 70s. Whether it goes back is contested, but it's hard to see. Jim thought enough about this little stone that it was, in his mind, broken off and broken in half by treasure hunters and people coming out, and that this strange shape that you can see on that picture shows that there was what he thought was half of the ship. So if you put the other side together, it was a full, oblong sort of cigar or disc-shaped object with portholes. And that seems very imaginative, and Jim was always creative, and I loved that. But this stone actually went missing in June of 1973, soon after there was a cemetery watch put up because of these groups wanting to exhume the body. That's the number one thing people ask about the Aurora case, is why don't they just put this to rest and go dig it up once and for all? And of course, how how clever it is to think of that idea. But 50 years ago, people were really serious about trying to do that, and to no avail. So it's still an ongoing thing that, there's no one allowed to go and dig it up. But they are also worried because there was a spotted fever at the time, and they didn't want to bring that back potentially. So the idea of this gravesite not being known is really not the case. People say no one knows where it really is buried. Well, as far as that location, that is definitely known. Whether there's something there or not, that can be looked into as well. But the idea that the missing headstone's gone and no one knows where that spot really was. That's not true. It's very easily accessible. It can very well be determined even by some of the things that are out there, and the latest sort of investigations that have been done really found kind of the exact area where that's alleged to house or host some small child-sized grave. So throughout the years, it was not really, as far as the Aurora story I refer to as a legend, it really didn't get any attention from the time it came out all the way to the late 60s. And then local newspaper writers started getting into it. Someone from England came out for the Flying Saucer Review newsletter and investigated it. William Driscoll, on behalf of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, came out to investigate it. A scientist from a local technical college in '66 came out to investigate it. It was interesting to a number of people who were, credentialed enough to go and with what they had at the time to actually do a field investigation to try to determine like if there was really anything to it. All of them basically said there's not anything that they could find. They couldn't find a windmill. The metal that they found was too contemporary. And then later on in the 70s, so I just want to mention that it's interesting to see like J. Allen Hynek of, ufological lore and, all these things that people refer to being in Blue Book and Air Force's investigation of UFOs and going on to form QFOS. It's interesting to see even someone like Hynek was interested in the Aurora story. And, Jacques Vallée, his contemporary, came out and investigated it as well. A lot of people have been there to look into seeing if there's any tangible evidence. So in the 70s, because of all that, people came, they did find metal. A physicist at the local North Texas State University at the time, now UNT, University of North Texas, school I went to for a little while, there was a physicist and other people there that were interested in studying metal that was found. And the only thing that was found that seemed a little bit odd about this metal that wasn't ordinary was that it had high concentrations of aluminum and zinc and some iron, but had no magnetic properties, which was extremely unusual. And that it would have been hard to have access to this type of aluminum before the 1930s or 1910s.
Very expensive too. I mean, any production of aluminum early on was extremely expensive, like almost like gold. That's what I've heard. Now, I don't know if that's, this is going way back before the internet. I remember reading something about that, but just real quickly, they've had, the way this thing supposedly caught on fire and everything. I know, all the way back in the Civil War, the Union had balloons, and they had these hydrogen machines that they used to fill up with hydrogen. Of course, hydrogen is extremely flammable, and these things, would blow up. And there was that problem, and they did mention it was a very fiery crash, and it makes you really wonder what made it a fiery crash, and could it have been hydrogen?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. A lot of people like the obviously the sensational explanation of it having being an alien. And a lot of the newspapers use that as a headline. In the 70s, it was like national news. And this is part of the research project I've been working on, is essentially to document all ways in which the Aurora legend has been portrayed in all multimedia formats over the last century. And I found it's extremely overwhelming because it's next to Roswell and some of those other big names as one of the most publicized events of an otherworldly encounter. So in the 70s, especially 73, it's all over the states, and some newspaper published by the Associated Press, the United Press International. And here, as you can see, Jim Mars even is writing about it as he was a writer for the local newspaper, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, before he was ever a really well-known author of some of his best-selling books. And so it's really cool to see he was interested in helping to, look into this way back in the 70s before people knew him as this, established journalist, which is great. And because of him, he's how I'm familiar with any of this stuff. So a lot of what I'm doing is in honor of our great buddy Jim Mars, and thanks to him, it's important that we can see that people are doing like what you're helping to establish with this journalistic work. It's like a work of anthropology in some way. We're able to connect with all these amazing people who have stories, a contribution, and points of data to contribute to the community and the greater society at whole. Jim was very much in tune with a lot of that. He challenged the status quo of tackling difficult journalism topics, even back in the 70s, and it was something that was controversial. So, I just want to give a shout out to my buddy from Mars, of course. And I would just say that's really important to keep in mind that, even though I really looked up to him, I don't put him on a pedestal. I think even looking at some of the stuff he got wrong often, and I thought that was okay, because he was willing to kind of say, oh, all right, I'm just doing what I can. If I can't document it, and if I can learn from something, that's great. And so I've been able to find some things that help to be reassuring of that quality of investigating, even in this journey of Aurora, because there's so much that gets mistaken, that gets taken out of context, that's erroneous, and often misattributed to wrong dates, wrong people. So I would just say that when it comes to Aurora, in the 70s, it became an extremely sensational news item. MUFON did actually find it compelling enough that the charred remains of the molten state of metal, and the charred and burnt stones and limestone and materials that we're finding, it was convincing enough to John Schuessler of MUFON and Walt Andrus and people like Bill Case and eventually others, that something did actually happen that creates an extreme amount of heat, probably, which can be inferred as an explosion, just as you were pointing out, Martin. And I think it's important to consider, what are the alternatives? Were there actually ships that used some kind of compressed air or some gas that would have been explosive? Because it sounds like, if this is all really what happened as far as the explosion, that maybe there was something out there that exploded. Maybe some of the debris wasn't otherworldly, but was of some interesting construction or a contraption that the inventor, whoever was piloting this potential craft, who's met their demise. If you look at some, unfortunately, when people are in unfortunate situations and they get really mangled, bodies are hard to identify, and so maybe they found the remains that didn't seem to be all that human appearing, but who knows? So I think that that's an interesting component. It puts it in that otherworldly category, other than just sort of a terrestrial, cryptic kind of creation. So I think that it's really important to keep that in mind, that maybe, and even talking to some of the old timers there in Aurora, it's really interesting to see that their perspective is that some of them think that, oh, it's not that it was a hoax and it didn't happen, but it just couldn't, there's no way that it could have been an alien spaceship from what other place in time and space, because they were told it was a 2-engine powered motor with gasoline, and that it broke down or something. So I've heard some really outlandish ideas that weren't necessarily debunking it, but were taking it out of the category of extraterrestrial. So those are great points, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, that there are some alternative considerations to the Aurora story.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing about that. My thoughts about that is, it seems to me that if it was an inventor, say, you would think that he would have connections enough to know that he was missing, and that that there was a fiery crash, and someone would be coming to claim the body. You would think, because it couldn't go to that very far. A craft, I wouldn't imagine, could go more than, like, I'm just guessing, but 10 miles would be a big stretch for something like that to go. So I mean, if that's what indeed happened, I'm just surprised no one ever came forward and to claim the body, or claim that they knew the person. Which is another mystery.
It's a challenge to find any of the potential remains of any of the alleged airship stories, not just Aurora, but like the hundreds of airship reports nationwide. If any number of them, let's say all of them were hoaxes, but 1% or half of 1%, then that means that there could still potentially be like someone's, antique airship out in a shed or a barn, or crashed somewhere. So I'm hopeful, in a weird way, I guess, but I'm hopeful that maybe there actually are remains yet to be found, and that's like an archaeological gold mine. Obviously, that would totally rewrite modern aviation history, even in this the simplest terms, to think that, okay, well, maybe the Wright brothers weren't the first, but there's a lot of ideas about how discovery is not instantaneous and by way of declaration, and that we have to make sure that there's the correct process in which things can get reviewed, established in journals, and then be publicized through media. But things are changing now. Now that we have instantaneous ability to live stream, a lot of these types of things make news a lot quicker. And so it is curious to think, okay, if this had a person perish, or all these other stories talked about a crew, that someone, like you said, would have enough connections to know that would have been this person or that. So there are ideas of the telegraph community on the railways having concocted the story. And I think that it's really interesting to see that maybe that could account for some of it, but I don't know if it was all of it. So some ideas have been discussed as far as where these airship stories originate, but it's difficult because the only other person, one of the other big names as far as paranormal, unexplained mysteries, anomalous things, or more particularly Fortean phenomena, it was Charles Fort. He wrote New Lands in 1920 and 22. And he was one of the first people ever to investigate the reports of the airships from 20 years earlier. And he wasn't considered a UFO investigator, but it's exactly what he was doing at a time when no one else was really looking into those at the time, even then, historical reports. So he didn't say anything about Aurora directly, but he does say that there could be data to suggest that there are what he referred to as extra mundane voyagers during the month of April in 1897. So I think it's pretty cool. But throughout that, the 20s and 30s, there's not a lot going on. Apparently, there are reports of people seeing things out in the Gulf of Mexico. But I want to say that just as a sort of honorable mention, the cool idea, of course, a lot of people, Roswell's a household name. Most people who keep up with this know about it. But even if you don't, you kind of relate Roswell to the idea of UFOs or otherworldly visitors or something to that effect. And I would just make a mention that those famous pictures, or maybe infamous pictures of what looks like people holding up tinfoil or aluminum foil, those pictures of Jesse Marcel and General Roger Ramey were taken in Fort Worth for a public media shoot to really kind of dissuade the public from there being any real concern about flying saucers, and that those were actually just parts of a weather balloon. And whether that was really the case or not, that guy in the picture there, and these are housed at the Roswell's International UFO Museum and Research Center. But it's pretty cool to see that they have them. I've seen them here. The local campus at University of Texas in Arlington has these copies, or the originals, the negatives. And Jesse Marcel there came out later saying whatever he was holding, he did not think was the original material he originally saw, and that the original material was not made on this earth. And that's just his claim. A lot of people contest to that. But I would say that, it's interesting that all of that, the story of Roswell, how big that is, those pictures that help to really give it some context and some kind of reference point were taken here in Fort Worth, Texas, in like my hometown area. So it's kind of a neat thing that happened in 47.
Interesting. I wanted to show you something here. And we were talking about airships earlier. And check this out. This was the Simeon Perkins' diary of October 12th, 1796, basically talking about witnessing a ship up in the air with figures on it. And I'm not sure if this talks about lights coming down or not, but we think of the airships as what you were saying in the late 1800s, but there were other accounts, that pop up now and then. I just thought that was interesting. Anyone can find that online, Simeon Perkins' diary.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's great. So we're only 5 minutes away from closing off of KGRA, so we didn't really have any time to have any call-ins. But I'd like to continue on, if that's okay with you. And just to let the people at KGRA know, I have a Lard Scranton on next week. We'll be back with him. It's up in the air whether I'm going to be going to Washington, D.C. for the hearing, if it does happen. Sounds like it will be happening on the 13th. I was at the last one. I don't think I'm going to make this one just because of a situation is kind of conflicting. So may not be able to make that one in particular. But anyway, I just thought I'd say goodbye for now to all those people over at KGRA Radio, and we'll see you next week. I'd like to continue on, if we can shift gears here. I will check to see if there's any questions that came in, but I'd like to continue on with another case. I think the Aurora one is fascinating. The one question I have, how close did they ever come to actually exhuming that body?
Well, I think that's a really great question. And I think it's important to resolve some of the mystery of the case overall. And I'll just say that, kind of picking up really quick, into the 80s, they made a movie as sort of riding the coattails of E.T. at the time, about a friendly alien movie. And so that really didn't do much to help enliven the case. In the 90s, it's a fun film. You can watch it on YouTube for free. But, in the 90s, they had the 100th anniversary, so it made some news. But it didn't really rile up enough people to try to make any real attempt at action. But But it wasn't until the 2000s that the History Channel got involved. John Greenwald, who you mentioned earlier, actually did his first documentary on Aurora. They couldn't get access to the well, but they talked about the gravesite. But a few years later, they had a show called The UFO Hunters. And the UFO Hunters did go out there. They did unseal the well. And this was thanks to Ken Sherry, who I mentioned earlier, who helped to get all this worked out. They sent Pat Uskert down the well, and they sent the other guys over to the grave with ground penetrating radar. Now, nothing was found from the well. They did test the water. I don't think they found any strong reading or indication of anything anomalous. But what they could find over the grave that they could really pinpoint based upon that original stone and some other things that they used to sort of triangulate the location. They basically determined that there is a small child-sized grave at that location. But they were unable to determine like the contents of the grave and see what it actually was or what was really inside. And who knows, if it's a body, it could be dust. I've been told by people at the historical community there that they actually transferred bodies from an older cemetery. And I've heard that claim is actually contested as well, even by people from the historical community. So there's a lot of question marks, but it sounds like that the idea is that that's probably the closest that's happened. In the 70s. It put a halt on any real, I mean, people were ready to come digging, and then 50 years later, there hasn't really been much that's happened. There has been a large stone marker that was recently moved, but the main thing I'd say that helps to kind of shed any light about that situation is the non-invasive technique of ground penetrating radar, or GPR, that can be used in a lot of ways, archaeologically speaking, that have been a huge innovation in techniques, field investigations. And so I think that even now it's kind of dated. If someone could go there and acquire the appropriate permissions to do that now with like modern technology, who knows? You could probably find out quite a bit. Whether there's anything really there or not, it would still be a worthwhile pursuit, I think, historically. So with that, I would say that that's probably the closest that anyone's really come. But the town, we held an event there. They raised enough funding and resources to relabel the town branding. They established a whole city monument. It's a really small town. You drive right through if you didn't know where you're going. And unfortunately, the person at the time who was involved with the city, who helped with all of that, it was cool that they did that, but they turned out, they apparently went rogue and turned into a huge criminal and stole a bunch of like hundreds of thousands of dollars, or not, if not like more than $1 million. That's not cool. So they burned down the city hall, destroying all of the evidence of that. And then the museum that would research some of the historical Aurora documents and files and city information burned down last year. And so really unfortunate, strange fires. I don't know that there's any connection between all of that, but it's just unfortunate either way how we lose history. So I'm doing what I can to keep track of that. But, as far as a real investigative effort, hopefully there can be more. But I would say for anyone who's interested, check out the 2008 episode of the UFO Hunters. I think it's called the Texas Roswell, our first contact. Yep.
Bill Burns. Yeah, I talked to him about that. I remember. But here's a question, and I want to go into a different one after this. Have you ever interviewed? I don't know if you know of this particular case where there was a huge triangular craft witnessed over his property. Are you familiar with that?
There are various triangular cases. I mean, if I had maybe a little bit more information on that, it doesn't sound particularly familiar. Although I do know there have been, like in 1965, I think in Damon, Texas, or there's one in 65, but there's one around there, or Sherman perhaps, that was an enormous triangular object seen by law enforcement. And that's probably a different case, but that I think just goes to show that people are seeing triangular objects. They're not just seeing discs or amorphous lights. But apparently there are triangular objects that are seen, and it makes us again wonder if there are ours, theirs, what's going on with that. I'm not sure about that particular one, but yeah, I'd be glad to find out more if anyone would like to, get connected and share about what they know.
Yeah. I wrote him when he first posted that, and someone said, "Isn't that Stephenville?" But that was a different thing. But anyway, hopefully he'll post where that was in particular. But let's. There was a case, was in 1883, also in Texas, Marfa Lights.
Yeah,
right?
This is cool. This is a little bit of a tangent off from the main UFO, contemporary outlook of like mechanical nuts and bolts craft. So the Marfa lights is a mystery light phenomenon that people have seen out in the deserts of West Texas, the Chihuahuan Desert, for years. The first documented sighting is in 1883 by a man named Robert Ellison. And he basically shared that he could see these strange lights, but that people had already been seeing them for years and thought that they were either campfires or some kind of ghost light, like a supernatural phenomenon. And people would ride out into the desert and try to look for these things. But that's the earliest known recording is in 1883. Now, from 2001 until today, there's this viewing platform that's been erected. It's looking out at a place called Mitchell Flat, which is way out in the desert. The light phenomenon that can be viewed or witnessed there is not just a singular issue that someone saw once in history and that was it, but it's an ongoing phenomenon that you can go out there and check out pretty much any time of the year or the night, not during the day, but at night. So what you're looking at here is a series of pictures that I took with my camcorder. I think this was about 5 or 6 years ago. The top row are all 4 lights moving, and they move all in perfect synchronicity with one another. The second row is a group of what looked like one light that merged or split into 2 and have a sort of core in the center. And the last row is one light over an exposure of about a minute that seemed to change colors, or the light frequencies were affecting my camera's ability to interpret what it was looking at. So I don't know what the Marfa lights are. Some people consider that they're a natural geophysical phenomenon, perhaps due to piezoelectricity, quartz, and the tectonic plating, all of these ideas, which are pretty cool. And I think that it's not an interactive phenomenon, meaning it's probably not an intelligent life form, although that would be interesting. That has been speculated. But they are some kind of light phenomenon that basically shows that there's movement, there's a sort of a pattern, and that probably could be what helps us understand a little bit more about what these mystery lights are that people see, not just in Marfa, but other places around the world. This is just one of them. And there's also other ideas of what's called Bragg Road or Ghost Light Road in north of Houston, Texas, I've been to, which is kind of similar. But these Marfa mystery lights are not way up in the sky. They're way over the desert, hovering. You can see the illumination of the ground below. But it is I'd say, important part of including this in the talk of UFOs, because it just goes to show that UFOs are again, not one unified objective idea, other than they're just something unidentified or unknown. So whatever those are very confusing. There's a historical marker out there that talks about unexplained phenomenon. And this is another marker there that talks about the history of the lights. So definitely an interesting place to go. It's got a 24-hour rest stop there at the viewing area. So I always recommend for anyone who wants to see a UFO, go check out the Marfa lights any time of year.
Yeah, I got to do that someday. And the strangest thing about that is, these pictures again. I'm assuming that you just pieced all this together. So just to give an overall visual. But you said the top lights are in formation, and do they actually move in formation?
Yeah, what I noticed, and this was just 4. Sometimes you have one, and then you have another one pop up, and then maybe one other or 2 more or more. And they'd all move together sporadically, almost like a butterfly. And again, this isn't way up in the sky. This is just way out in the desert, like on the horizon. And it's at nighttime. And so the first one you see of 4 lights was one photo. There's a composite image here of like the different lights, that have been put together in one image. But the top row of 4 lights was all seen at once. And they all moved, and then one would eventually fade away, and it'd just fade all the way back to one. The best explanation for them essentially is that they've been able to determine, because of process of duplication or through repetition, you have to be able to document something and be able to demonstrably show that it can be repeated in a scientific experiment. So one of the challenges is that the only thing that scientific investigations have done to show this is that basically car headlights have been seen and have been misinterpreted as what we call the Marfa lights. But apparently they've been seen since before there were even cars or highways. So something is out there, and whether it's a tangible form or entity, or it's a product, a causality of some issue geomagnetically or physically, whatever it is. There's a pretty cool number of books, but this is one of them called The Mysteries of the Marfa Lights Revealed. Another good book about the investigations done. And it's just a number of the important investigative parts about that, how some people do refer to it as geophysical, and some people think that maybe they are like beings that have been there forever or something. So ideas like that float around, but that is one of the ongoing mysteries that you can go and check out anytime, Marfa, Texas.
Now it comes to mind, Brown Mountain Lights. I don't know if you heard of them. That's in Virginia, I believe. I can't remember exactly where that is. I think it is, or West Virginia. There's the Brown Mountain Lights, and I've had someone that had a film of that on this show. And, I believe he said there was a high copper content. You're talking about quartz. It seems like it's associated a lot of times with some type of mineral or geological type of situation. And there's also in the Bridgewater Triangle, the Hockomock Swamp, I think it's called, something like that, that they see these lights, and they have seen them, in the 19th century as well. So it's really quite interesting, and makes, most likely all these are natural, but very strange phenomena. And
I think either way, whether they are what we could say is naturally or like terrestrial based or not, there's still a lot we can learn. And that's great, even if it's not always going to end up being alien spaceships or something. I think it's important to also keep that in mind, is that we can still learn a lot.
Right. And so what I'd like to do is, if we can keep talking just a little bit longer, I don't know, maybe another half hour or 15 minutes to half an hour, but I'd like to talk about two cases that I have an interest in. One of them, of course, is a cache landrum, and the other one is the Lubbock. I always say it wrong.
Yeah, no problem.
The Lubbock lights. Which one would you like to talk about first?
Well, we can get into the lights first. Lubbock lights. I think that one's important to just mention because of very similar to some of the ideas of the more notable UFO cases out there. One we mentioned earlier, the Stephenville. Some people say the Stephenville lights or Stephenville UFO. This was documented. This is a series of photographs taken by not just scientists, but professors there at the technical college of the time. Now it's Texas Tech. And this was seen by multiple people leading up to this. This is an interesting idea that is proposed, that these lights, as you can see, are individual lights that maybe came together to form a massive delta or V-shaped craft. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that was put forward by some of the other alternative considerations was that these were plovers or plover birds reflecting lights off of the newly installed street lamps nearby in town. And this was also used as a way to investigate some of the early government military efforts. It was something that Ruppelt wrote about in his book. It's actually one of the cover photographs for the historic UFO book by Edward Ruppelt. And Project Blue Book is a big proponent of this case. And, it was something that I think they thought highly enough, was that we've got it, just like the whole Stephenville issue, if we've got something this big flying over a major city, something needs to be checked into. So that's an interesting idea, that in 1951, there's this enormous craft, potentially, or plover birds, if you like, flying over getting enough attention to warrant the official investigation of the government. And if you want a fun recreation of this, you can watch episode 3 of season 1 of Project Blue Book, the fictionalized version on the History Channel, that is all about the Lubbock Lights incident. So it's a fictionalized version of the show. Some people can't stand that about it, but have some fun and watch this episode about the Lubbock Lights on the Project Blue Book show. And so it's a pretty interesting episode in UFO history from Texas.
Now, let me ask you this. What are these arrows? And by the way, all these images are going to be, for you that's listening in audio, all of these images are in the show notes. You can check them out if you'd like. And there's always a link to the show notes on the audio podcast. So what is the arrow in all these images? One or two arrows?
I think they seem to indicate separate or individual lights that were witnessed nearby, but weren't part of the main formation, as it seems. And that's to be used to point out, I think, that the idea of these moving objects were not all uniform, but or that they weren't all a unified object, but they actually all had some independence. And I think that's just to point out the notable independent ones from the main core group that show movement, because you can see that the ways that these main lights work together is pretty even. Then, if you go from top left to top right, bottom left to bottom right, they seem to move in a way that is separating them and giving the impression of motion. So this is a really fantastic photograph, considering that how hard it is to find even modern legitimate photographs of UFOs or any unknown objects. Extremely impressive for 1951, I'd say.
Right. Now, you talk about the witnesses, and they're from that tech school. And it seems to me that they would know the difference between birds flying and, birds above. Even if they're being reflected, they could see that they were, flapping. You would be able to see some type of movement that would be, indicative of birds in flight. This is all speculation because I don't know, but it just seems to me that they would be intelligent enough to say, oh, that's, just birds, but they actually took pictures of what they were seeing. So they must have believed it was, more of just the reflections. I mean, is there, in the witness accounts, are they talking about they looked like actually like lights themselves?
Yeah, I think that it seems to be described as individual orb-like lights that seem to form a shape. It's hard to say that anyone really did see a bird in the sense that it was obviously a bird. But I think it's really interesting to consider that, as you mentioned, it's one of the challenges we face, I think, as a society. It's ingrained with us to have a plea to authority. Argument of authority is essentially that, well, if they are scientists and they are professors at a university, then they should have the know-how and the authority of the discipline to be able to make that determination. Argument for authority sometimes gets the best of us because, it could be that there were some birds seen, but it could be that there was a genuine phenomenon that was witnessed that was nothing to do with birds. So I think it's challenging us in some way to know that even experts, and I'm not saying UFO experts, I'm saying scientific experts in their respective disciplines, are sometimes wrong, and sometimes don't get things correct despite their background or their skills. It's important to remember that. So I don't know. I would say that just this being one of the most notable UFO photographs helps to establish it as giving it a face, so to speak, in this whole field and study, because without something like that, it really just becomes an account based upon testimony, and not just worded testimony that's been transcribed, but here's a physical representation of what people saw, and again, enough so to give it consideration beyond just a few folks in town thought they might have seen birds to warrant official investigation from the government to come out and say what's going on in this strange way out of nowhere Texas town that obviously birds or not has enough happening to get the federal side of things involved. So I think that it could be that maybe some people did see birds. I don't know that that accounts for the totality of the Lubbock Lights incident, but it has actually had an impact on their town. They don't have a big festival or anything, but there's a publication called the Lubbock Lights that actually is proud to say that we're named this because of our incident from 51. And they just posted something about that, which I've shared on some social media and stuff. It's cool to see that people are embracing of this. It wasn't something I think people took as a an omen of invasion. Like, it wasn't a negatively interpreted event that I think had an effect on the town in a bad way, but it did obviously put Lubbock on the map for the UFO crowd to remember this historic incident. From all these years back at this point, these photographs really stand, I think, the test of time to show that people have been trying to capture something like this, whether it shows movement, it shows objects, whether it shows birds or not. It's really important to see that people have tried to make the effort of doing what we now think is sort of like a modern attempt at investigating UFOs. This has been happening for well over half a century at this point.
It seems to me this would be very easily provable if you have the exact location where that picture was taken to repeat it even right after, if there were actually plovers flying, so this is right. Lubbock is right near the shoreline. Is it near the?
It's definitely, it's all the way out in West Texas. It's like probably 5 hours from me here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So not near the ocean or water at all. It's out.
So why would plovers be there? They're shorebirds. That's
Right.
unless there's a body of water, they could be at other bodies.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge of why it seems so maybe ridiculous that the official explanation was, or the closest type of explanation that made any sense to people who had a say in the matter, was that these must have been birds reflecting the lights that were newly installed in town like 2 miles away. So it doesn't really
Ah,
hold up, but
yeah.
it's just a difficult type of thing that it's hard. I think sense could be made out of it being people seeing birds, but it seems like a stretch to me. But maybe, so I think that it's important to see how, yeah, it's definitely landlocked. It's nowhere near the water, and it's not just seen by some people out in their backyard. It's seen by people in town, people in the community, academics, and they thought enough of it to try to document it by taking pictures and being ready to do that, because it was over a series of nights, and so it's not just a
Oh,
one-time thing.
oh, how about that? Wow. Okay. Well, that's to me. I always thought that was an interesting one, and so many. I mean, Texas is so huge. I mean, it's just such a vast amount of land. Like you said, that's 5 hours from you. But to travel from one, if you were traveling to each corner of the state, there was a friend that I had back in the '70s when he was in high school. He did a report. I think he said at that time, every single person in the world could fit 3 to an acre or something in Texas. It was something ridiculous. I mean, that's how much land there is there, which is it's so vast. And I know when I've driven across it, it seems like it takes forever. Cash Landrum, 1980. This is a really, to me, my thoughts already is that it was a government experiment gone wrong. That's kind of the bottom line of what I think it is. But I want to know what you think about the whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's, when you asked earlier what's like the one case that stands out to me, it's hard not to say this one. And I think the reason why is because it pinpoints several issues about the UFO subject and UFO culture that I think is a difficult area to focus in on, because people want things to be more exotic than they actually are. People want there to be alien spaceships. People want there to be alien beings and all of this. And I think there very well could be. I don't try to make any assertions or bold claims that are, way outside of my ability to make those determinations. I think it's all interesting, and I think that there are some challenges with certain cases. The thing about the Cash Landrum case, and I would say the definitive book that's been put out by John Schuessler, has some pretty cool artwork that shows what these three people witnessed. And in December of 1980, what you have happen, basically December 29th, you have Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and her grandson Colby Landrum driving down an old country road. They were trying to find some places to play bingo and maybe eat. And after a night of looking around for things to do, they eventually were riding back on one of these old country roads, and they started hearing and seeing several helicopters. And this got their attention because amongst these helicopters was a strange square or diamond-shaped object that seemed to be emitting light and getting lower and lower. This whole convoy was very confusing because they counted up to nearly 24 black, some of them double rotor Chinook helicopters, military helicopters, all surrounding this strange glowing diamond-shaped object, which started, unfortunately, to go down, seeming to be in distress, shooting and emitting light or fire or flames down into the road in front of them, causing them to have to stop. And this was a pretty incredible thing to observe for them, because the grandson at the time, Colby, asked his grandmother, Vicki, what is that up there in the sky? And to allay any concern or fear, she had told him, that's Jesus. This is the second coming. And unfortunately, that wasn't the case at all. It's very tragic what happened to them. Betty ended up getting out of the car, and Vicki kind of got out, and so they're seeing this giant craft, this object shooting, emitting light down below, burning and scorching the road. They could feel this immense heat searing them, actually, to the point that they get back in the car, and one of them put their hands on the dash, and it melted into the dash with an imprint. And eventually this whole entourage took off and kept on going, and they made it safely back home. Unfortunately, their hair started falling out. They had blisters all over their body, terribly sick, throwing up, and were not doing very well. And they attempted to sue the Air Force because they were under the impression that this was some kind of experimental craft that was being used, maybe in, secret or something, that affected them and made them unwell. And it seemed that they had obvious and very bad signs of radiation poisoning. They didn't die immediately from this, but it affected their lives greatly. And I want to give you a shout out, Martin, because you actually have had Colby Landrum, who is now an adult.
Yeah.
One of the few appearances he's ever made in his adult life to tell about this historic yet tragic event. And I think it's really important that we can note that you've done that to be able to share with us. It's incredibly difficult for anyone to come forward about this. And I would say that it's also important to note that they in no way ever insinuated that they thought this was an alien or extraterrestrial craft or technology, but at every chance that they could, they tried to hold the government and military accountable, which very likely never happened. There are some people who find some challenges with the story. I think it's very unfortunate what happened to these people. Colby Landrum is the only living witness and victim, I would say, of the incident at this point. This took place north of Houston in an area now called Huffman, in Montgomery County. And it's not something that has a historical marker, but the picture that you pulled up first is actually a photograph I took about 2.5 years ago of the original location. It's been redone. One of the interesting things about what John Schuessler of MUFON describes in their investigation is that a clandestine cleanup crew came over and redid the road almost immediately. But there was apparently a black spot. I got this location from a witness who said they lived there. They knew what happened while they were there while it happened. And a dark circle was left on the road. And so that all apparently has been redone several times now. It's been a number of years, 40 years. And I should also note that the curious thing about this case, maybe there's not any direct relation, is that half a world away over in Suffolk, England, Rendlesham Forest, you have the Rendlesham Forest UFO incident happening basically at the same exact time, December 26th, 27th, 28th, and 29th. And the last day is probably one of the more notable days for that. So it's interesting, the Rendlesham UFO incident is the most notable UK or England UFO story. And in both instances, you have people in close proximity to an unknown object and being affected by it physically, or that they are claimed to have been affected by it. And so I don't know that there's any direct connection to that. But I would say that, the one in Texas, I think is very unfortunate because they never, to my knowledge, received any medical aid that was from anyone being held accountable for this. But I also wonder, when else would you ever see 23 helicopters all at once? Maybe an air show, maybe a maneuver or demonstration or war game scenario being conducted. But it's very rare that anyone sees that many helicopters on any basis. So to my outlook on that is to also wonder, were those people affected? Did those people in those helicopters know what they were even doing, or what they were next to, or that we'll ever hear from any of them coming forward about this? Now, there have been people who've come forward to say, well, yeah, that object, like Richard Doty claims that this object came from Area 51. Now, he can claim that. He can also say anything. And it's also difficult to really pin down whether you can trust someone like that.
Right.
And I've talked to him, I've interviewed him face to face. And I think that, people get the wrong impression about guilty by association. If you talk to this person in ufology, then you've lost all integrity. And I think that that's really, I get it. And some part of me thinks that that's all nonsense, because if you're doing something to talk to people, it doesn't necessarily equal advocacy. I don't think that it's necessarily that like you have anyone on your show doesn't immediately mean that you're in agreement with them or that you believe everything they are sharing, right? So it's one of those things where, I've met Doty, I've talked to him. He says that this object came from Area 51. I don't know about that. I think that's a wild claim, that there's no way to prove that at all. It's very interesting. I think that it very well could be an object from a nearby facility, perhaps even from here in Texas. There are apparently a number of secretive underground or military installations here in Texas that could easily get a number of those helicopters out up in the air in a very short amount of time, specifically for a circumstance like this. Now, the weird thing about it is we don't know if those helicopters were there in pursuit of the object as it was potentially going down, if they were escorting it. A lot of speculation. So I think that my outlook on it is that I think that it's an experimental or maybe a craft that was having some distress. And if there were pilots in there, that's really unfortunate because, if we're talking about two people, passersby, 2 or 3 really, that got affected by this from cars view away, like imagine the pilots inside. Yeah, it's hard to say, and I don't want to wildly speculate on anything really, but I would say that it's important to just keep in mind that there are a lot of challenging factors about the Cash Landrum incident that should make us reconsider some of those positions that we hold close to our heart, like maybe all these things are ET or they're not or whatever it is. I think that's important to realize that some people are being physically affected and not for the better, and that these Cash and Landrum, all of them, never assumed this was an alien spaceship, and they tried to rightfully sue the Air Force because that's the only people that they could consider could have been responsible, and they couldn't. It didn't work. They couldn't sue them. It never turned out in their favor, and they just said that they were never accountable. So in the event that you really trusted that answer, that it wasn't really the Air Force, that's almost even more wild to think that, well, then who really was it? Right. Because if it wasn't the Air Force or maybe any other known branch of the military, and they're not going to come out and be like, wow, well, we were doing testing in the area. There's never any accountability been made by any government military about that. It makes it really kind of an eye-opener to consider, well, we haven't seen this pop up at an air show, and maybe there's good reason. Maybe these experimental things weren't working out, and that's one got out of hand, or who knows. So some people think it was nuclear propulsion or whatever is going on. And
the nuclear propulsion idea makes a lot of sense. And I know they were working with Stanton Friedman talked about him being involved in looking into that, or at some point maybe in Los Alamos or Westinghouse or somewhere. I can't remember where it was, where he said he actually was. They were talking about nuclear propulsion back in the 60s, I thought he said. But on one of my shows, he talked about it. But anyway, for them to dig up the road and everything, and it sounds like radiation to me, with what they were suffering from and all that, and crazy. And this is someone saying that Richard Doty claimed that Cash Landrum case was not military testing nuclear power craft. So I don't know where that comes from, Roger. I'm not really sure, but what to believe. Like, it's kind of hard to believe, Rick Doty, what he's saying. He's getting a lot of press these days, and I just don't know what to think about the integrity of what he says. I don't know.
I would just say that, I've definitely heard him say that. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't think there's a way to prove that it's true. I'm not necessarily saying that I believe that. I would say that it's interesting when people can chime in. If you have a foothold in the ufology community and you chime in on a case that's historic that no one's really around. Like you said, Colby's not out there on shows. He's not out at events and conferences. He actually probably wants nothing to do with any of this stuff, which, it makes a lot of sense. But it's easy to comment on a case about a very sensational concept that you can't corroborate at all. It's sensational, and maybe that's the intention, and I don't know. But I would say that it's important to just know that people have chimed in about things like the Cash Landrum case in much more recent times in an attempt to either say it's this or that. And I think it's important to just not lose track that these are important cases now 40 years ago that really should make us reconsider some of the things that we've seen and heard. And again, it's just interesting that it coincides with the Rendlesham Force case as well.
I think I'd like to end the show with this last question for both of us. I'm not sure how I'm going to answer it, but Terrence, we're actually not going to be talking about the Rendlesham Force. Thank you for that question, though. So one more question for us both. What do we hope to see happening by the end of 2024?
Well,
You go first.
sure. I just think, I'll just say this in closing. I just want to give a shout out really quick to a lot of people have taken the time to put some research together about Texas UFOs. We could go on for hours. And anyone can go and pause these later on. Close Encounters of the Texas Kind by my buddy Mitchell Whittington, newer book. Lone Star Saucers by another friend of mine, Nate Riddle, pretty cool catalog. And then, of course, one of the better ones I would say out there, Texas UFO Tales, Mike Koch and Bo Derek as well. And so I think it's really important to see that this is been documented for a long time, and that what is important about the historical cases is that it can give us some reference to what's happening now. I am not a big proponent of the disclosure movement, and I'm not saying that I am in disagreement with it, but I think that it's a bit of a pipe dream for a lot of people who think that the next big thing is that they're just going to come out and say they're here. And as interesting as that would be, I actually tend to consider that I'm hopeful that there are some very serious people, anthropologists and people who are in the appropriate disciplines to manage navigating the subsequent release of information pertaining to something that would eventually have to be revealed in the extent that people think disclosure is this thing going to happen, like all at once. Why I say that is because all these things that have happened over the last few years, there's a lot in the media that's never been discussed before, a lot in government and in Congress that's happening that's never really happened in this way. It's important to keep eyes on this topic and issue. It's important to also, I think, not necessarily just be persuaded by what looks and sounds good, because there's a lot of fraternization. There's a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of drama when it comes to the research and the community of people. I think it's important to also see that there are motives and agendas at play by various parties with various interests. Yes. I think that when it comes to what's happening in government, we should all pay attention. We don't necessarily have to say that we believe or have to go with what's being said. We should just make sure we're at least aware of the current events and issues taking place, like the recent upcoming hearings going on in just like a little over a week, I think. And that's important to know that, we can at least see what was happening, whether there's any real motion or momentum to this or not. I think it's really something that we have to think about in a different way than suddenly they're just going to announce things happening. And I would just say overall, in my perspective, I'm hopeful that things will continue to develop in a way that is encouraging of steps in society towards embracing and being open-minded to learning more about the world and beyond of what we live with, here together, and then what could potentially be beyond our world in a way that helps us open our mind to the possibility that not only are we not alone, but hopefully that'll make us come closer together as humans, as humanity, and in a way that's going to be helpful, in uniting us rather than dividing us. And I think it's going to be a tough set of hurdles to go through. But I do think that, with small steps of releasing information regarding not just, revealed or previously concealed information, like people want the government to come clean. I don't know that that's ever going to happen. In my view, disclosure is this idea that the government's going to come out and say, okay, sorry guys, we've been lying for almost a century or more maybe. And we're sorry. And this is actually what's going on. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't think there's any accountability ever going to happen. I mean, we could still see that same thing with JFK and all this. I would say though, what an alternative route would be is to be hopeful that there are people in place that have the ability and resources to integrate these concepts in smaller increments or adjustable increments that develop with potential findings that are going to be current and relevant rather than historic, in a way that can maybe lend credence to looking back at other historic instances that might change our outlook altogether. So anyway, I would just say that let's pay attention to what's going on. Let's keep our minds open to the possibilities, and we don't have to necessarily fall into one category or another. We're all doing what we can. Not everyone's on the same page, and I don't think that that's ever going to happen, but we can at least know that the more we are learning about our place in the universe, it'll help bring us together, and I'm hopeful that we can be able to have more compassion towards one another because of that.
Well, yeah, what he said, that's what I'll have to say. That was perfectly said. Thank you so much. And yeah, what else could I hope for? But also for something to bring us together, and we could really use that these days. And I really appreciate it. You did not let me down. You did this show wonderfully, just like I thought you would be. And it's been a real pleasure having you on. And I want to remind everyone, you can go to the text in this program and you can see what's the name of the Texas, what's it called again? The website?
The Texas UFO Network. And you can also check out a lot of the media and things that I've been involved with on the Vortex as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Martin. Appreciate it. It's been an honor.
Yeah, take care. All right, everyone. So we'll be back next week, as I said, with Lard Scranton. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky. Thank you.